I resigned last month because at 3:17 a door on our unit accepted a master code that had been retired for 7 years, and 6 seconds after a man in an MRI scanner told me my pager would buzz it did. I was a neurologist at St. Augustine Regional Medical Center in Asheville, North Carolina for 22 years. I believed in rhythms and rules and the hum of machines that don't care about stories. This one still haunts me. Most nights began the same way. Badged of plastic, the soft click of the time clock, the taste of hospital coffee that sits on the tongue like a copper coin. The neuro wing glows a particular shade of tired blue under fluorescent lights, a color I used to joke we should bottle and call ICU Dawn. St. Augustine is a level to trauma center with 310 beds, 18 of them in the neuro ICU, 58,000 of visits a year. We live on protocols the way ships live on charts. Thursdays are mine, 7 p.m. to 7 a.m., a half-slept life stitched from handoffs and hallway nods. On the board that night in early February drizzling and 34 degrees, we had to post thrombectomy strokes there. Speech slurred into stubborn fragments, an epilepsy taper that would need tenderness, a demyelinating workup with a family that had done too much internet reading, and a transfer from a long-term acute care facility across town who looked at first glance like a routine consult. His name on the transfer sheet was Daniel Rice. The M's photo paperclip to the chart showed a bearded man in a Bruins cap holding a little girl whose grin looked too big for her face, to front teeth missing like white flags. Hypoxic brain injury after a house fire 11 months ago. Tragedy cannulated, minimally conscious but medically stable. A low-grade fever and decreased responsiveness had sent the LTAC into the familiar pinball of rule-out infection. Adjust meds. Ask neurology to write a note that covers everyone. I skimmed old ICU notes as the transport team rolled him into Neuro 12. Glasgow coma scale 8 to 10 for months. Intermittently tracked, squeezed to command on Tuesdays and never on Thursdays. Opened eyes to voice when the moon was right. Families can hold their breath for a year and call it hope. His wife, Emily, visited Wednesdays and Saturdays, read him a paperback about baseball parks now soft and swollen from handling, told him Red Sox scores that used to stick in his head like hooks. He arrived at 21:56 with the warm plastic smell of forced air blankets and chlorhexidine hanging in the room. He was thinner than his photo, cheekbones like parentheses drawing the rest of his face inward. The hair that had once been dark now came in gray and uneven, the way grass pushes through a field after a fire. His breathing was even on room air, a small mercy. Vitals: temp 100.6 degrees Fahrenheit, pulse 82, BP 128/76, respiration 16, to sat 97%. Pupils 3 millimeters and reactive. Knee and ankle reflexes present and brisk. His eyes didn't find me when I said his name, but there was a shine to them, not the empty glass of deep coma, more like water at twilight when you can tell if it reflects the sky or the riverbed. We drew blood before the ink on the transfer signature dried. CBC, CMP, CRP, cultures. We got a chest x-ray and a urinalysis because the body loves to hide fevers in coroners. I ordered a head CT because hope always walks with fear, and an EEG because 6 months prior someone had written. Non-convulsive seizures with a question mark that looked like a shrug. While I typed, the unit's steady clockwork tapped out the hour, cuffs inflating, for pumps chirping, ventilators sighing like sleeping animals. You learn a place by the noises it makes when it thinks no one's listening. Labs trickled in before midnight. White count 10.8. Hardly a hand wave. Sodium 140. Potassium 3.9. Glucose 96. Lactate normal. Chest x-ray clear as winter air. You're in with trace protein. No nitrites. No drama. Had CT. Old hypoxic insult in the watershed zones. Thin medial frontal lobes. Nothing fresh to explain the change. I felt the small relief you feel when nothing is on fire, and the larger dread of knowing not on fire is not the same as safe. At 0:41 the e-tech came with cold paste and a knitted cap. Fingers nimble in a choreography she could do asleep. FP1 and FP2, F7, F8, T3, T4, O1, O2, a constellation map of a mind that used to speak louder. The screen on the portable unit glowed with slow theta and delta, the drowsy mud of a cortex that's present but quiet, a swamp with a few fireflies. She left, and I sat in the chair by his bed longer than billing would advise. Down the hall, a housekeeping cart wheel sang its high rubber note every third rotation. A lonely cricket. Lemon cleaner drifted under the door. I should have moved on. We all should do many shoulds. I stayed because his eyelids trembled on the exhale like a man swallowing a word. At 2:03 the first odd thing happened. Jordan, the primary nurse meticulous, soft-voiced, a former ICU nurse who labels things other people don't need labels came to turn him and check lines. She asked him to squeeze her right hand. His fingers flexed. Reflexes do that. The body remembers moving long after it's forgotten why. Okay. Relax, she said out of habit. His grip softened. Reflexes don't obey okay. Relax. I stood. That small rise you do when your brain sits up dog-like. Daniel, I said, tasting the syllables. If you can hear me, blink twice. He blinked twice. Even as a metronome, it could mean everything or nothing. The worst lies neurologists tell themselves are the kind data doesn't challenge. We tested in the square way you do when you're trying to trap wishful thinking. Open and close your eyes. He did. Twice, with a hint of delay. Stick out your tongue. Nothing. Look at me. His gaze found mine and held for a beat. 2, 3. Then slid away like a fish that isn't ready to be caught. At that moment, the remote EEG feed at the nurse's station spiked from swampy delta to a neat band of alpha like someone drew a meadow over a bog. Artifact happens. Coincidence happens. But coincidence doesn't usually come with eye contact. By 3 o'clock his fever slid to 99.8 degrees Fahrenheit after acetaminophen. Emily arrived in a green knit hat dusted with mist, cheeks flushed from the February cold, clutching the dog-eared baseball book and a styrofoam cup she was never going to drink. Is he the same? She asked, and her voice did that unstable thing hope and exhaustion make together. I told her about the squeezing and blinking with the caution of a man carrying nitroglycerin. She laughed and sobbed at once, both hands covering her mouth, then reached for his left hand and told him about their daughter's spelling bee. Necessary, she said, is one shirt and a socks, so you remember the C's and S's. You taught her that, remember? Dan, in an ordinary room, ordinary talk about ordinary tricks would be a sweetness. In a neuro unit at 3 a.m., it feels like someone is threading the world back together one letter at a time. Daniel tracked her voice like a spectator at a slow tennis match. Left, right, left, a fragile attentiveness. His EEG softened towards something that could pass for a resting rhythm if you squinted. At 3:17 I asked, because I don't know who I am when I don't ask, do you know your name? Silence has rescued me from more disappointments than victory ever has. He said, hoarse and small and unmistakable, no, it wasn't refusal. It was bewildered honesty, the sound of a man finding his pockets empty. Do you know where you are? I said. Gentle? He blinked, then spoke with a round Midwestern vowel hadn't heard before. Riverview Medical, he said, as if reading it off a sign. Emily looked at me, eyebrows like question marks. I nodded because I wish I were the kind of person who didn't remember names hospitals used to have. We rebranded 8 years ago. The old wall clock that used to hang by the window was replaced last year. The coffee machine that sat on the counter by the sink moved during a remodel in 2013. He shouldn't have known any of that. He shouldn't have known anything. What year is it? I asked, because time tests are the bones of synoptic exams. He swallowed, neck muscle shivering with effort. 2010, he said. You don't build a miracle, you build a case. I ordered an MRI with diffusion and perfusion sequences. Not because I expected dead tissue to resurrect, but because pictures make liars of our certainty. I added thyroid and B12 for completeness, and ammonia because helicopter diagnoses love to hide in unglamorous places. I called respiratory to standby because people who wake from long silence sometimes forget how to breathe evenly when the world shouts back all at once. We sat him up, his blood pressure behaved like it remembered how. His temp glided to 99.2 degrees Fahrenheit and leveled like a plane. Numbers should have set me at ease. The EEC from 203 to 340 migrated from the heavy gate of theta into a frontally dominant alpha that woke when we spoke and dozed when we didn't. That's what waking looks like on a screen. But the body tells its own stories. He reached for Emily's cup with his left hand like it had been his first choice all his life, though his chart, his wife, and the calluses on his right palm said otherwise. He spoke in idioms Emily swore belonged to his college roommate from Indiana, phrases that had never lived in their kitchen. He recognized the unit by a name we'd buried, the placement of a clock we'd moved, the color of paint under layers I thought no one remembered. He was awake, but he had woken onto an older map. He was awake wrong. The MRI was supposed to be my tether. Old hypoxic changes painted the same withered coastline we knew. The hippocampi were slightly small, as you see in people who've been idling too long. Diffusion-weighted images, that faithful gossip that lights up when fresh insult jabs the brain, were clean. That should have calmed me. Instead, the normality rang false, like a counterfeit that's too perfect. How does a brain with that much old damage stand up and speak like a man who lost an hour, not a year? Red flag 1. Then, wasn't a flare, but a silence where a noise should be. Red flag 2 was more personal. He turned to Emily and called her Emmy Lou. She froze. Who used to call me that? She asked, reflexively turning it into the smallest possible question. My dad. She answered herself, because the dead insert themselves into conversations without permission. Then Daniel asked for Jordan by her maiden name. Jordan hadn't used that name since she changed the one on her badge 5 years ago. He had never met the version of her who wore it, who told you that. Jordan said, half laughing as if humor could get the door closed again. He blinked at the question like someone who has to explain water to people learning to swim. Red flag 3 wore navy scrubs and carried a laptop. Hospital IT showed up because the EEG remote feed had hiccuped into a fast, colored noise like the northern lights, and the clerk wanted it logged. He muttered to himself about firmware and updates and passwords. Then he asked, eyebrows lifting the fraction they lift when something truly odd peeks out, who changed the med room keypad code last night? No one had. But the log showed a successful entry at 3:17 using a master code that had been retired 7 years earlier when we changed vendors. If you've typed a code 1,000 times, your fingers remember where your mind tries not to? I felt the muscle memory flare in my knuckles like an old scar. We wheeled Daniel down for the MR at 5:29 through a hospital that feels like a ship at shift change, one crew sliding around the other. All of us pretending we weren't born in corridors. The machine room smelled like warm metal and dust, the scent of heat waking long coils. I explained the clank and hum he'd hear, how he needed to be still as stone. He watched me with the alert politeness you see in people listening in a language they used to speak. We moved him into the bore. The magnet began its whale song, those pulses you can feel in your fillings. In the third sequence, the scanner paused, a polite tone asking for a keystroke. In that small silence, the room breathed differently. The hair rose on my forearms. The cold wasn't cold so much as the sense that the space had become thinner. Daniel said, conversational and calm, Doctor, your pager will go off in 6 seconds. I thought 2 things at once. Don't you look at the clock, and you absolutely going to look at the clock. At 5 seconds my pager buzzed. The Neurologist clerk had sent a short code she would later apologize for fat fingering. It was nothing. It was exactly on time. We finished the scan. The images gave me nothing new. The elevator up felt too bright. Coincidence is cheap. Timing is mean. Aftershock arrived, wearing human faces. Dodge, the neurosurgeon on call, came by with sarcasm coiled around concern and said we were making alpha into angels and needed to repeat the eek because alpha happens. A hospitalist from day shift wandered in and floated the idea of a factitious disorder by proxy before remembering you can fake waking up and have a neurologist listen to you do it. IT insisted that retired codes don't work because they don't work, then shrugged and blamed a firmware burp for the med room entry at 317. Emily cried and laughed and demanded a shape for something that wouldn't hold still. Nurses argued in the break room over whether this counted as a miracle if it made you feel like you should whisper. We brought him back to his room in the bright edge of 7 a.m. Night shift was trying to become human again, day shift arriving scented with soap and sleep. He was tired now, edges fraying like cold cuffs. He still tracked. He still answered short questions with short truths. He still called the hospital Riverview, years out of date. He looked at me and called me Doc K, a name only people used to use, the one that was mine before the divorce when my smile still reached my eyes in photos. Would you have stayed in that room with me? I didn't ask it out loud. I asked it the way you ask yourself what you're made of. If you're still here, you're braver than I was. We tried to make science out of haunting. We repeated things like superstitions and documented them like studies. We swapped acetaminophen for saline and back because part of me wanted a drug to be the ghost. We dimmed lights and brightened them and watched the ego obediently rise and fall. We asked him to tell us the old keypad code 3 times and filmed the shape his hand made, then compared it to a video of mine from 2014 pulling meds before a night that went wrong. We played recordings of Emily's voice and Jordan's to measure his reactivity. The alpha rose like grass and whined, then lay flat again. We drew blood at noon and sunset as if the sun itself were a drug we could dose. Afternoon found him quieter. He slept in shallow returns. When he woke, he called the hospital by the old name again. He asked if the cafeteria still made pancakes on Fridays, a perfectly normal memory that was impossible because we stopped during COVID and never started again. When Alma the housekeeper floated to our unit for the first time in months to cover a sick call, he greeted her with a Spanish phrase her father used to say when she dug in stubborn. En I tanto que quim al santo. He shouldn't have known Alma or her father's music. The connection was a spider thread you can't see until it touches your face. That night I reread 11 months of notes. In April he'd opened eyes to command. In July he de-squeezed, once for yes and twice for no in the classic pseudo-code of hope. None of that explained the old clock placement, the retired code, the pager, the nickname from a dead man's mouth. I pulled the keypad logs again and stared until the digits turned into something swimming. The successful entry at 317 was right there like a recorded joke. Facilities, shrug and said old systems burp. Ghost entries happen. I didn't tell them which kind of ghost I had in mind. Data he plateaued on a shelf that wasn't ours. Neuropsychology arrived with patients the size of a county. They adapted tests for a hospital bed, spoke gently, didn't ask him to do things he couldn't. His immediate recall beat expectations like it had been practicing quietly while we weren't paying attention. Delayed recall tilted toward 2007 to 2011 like a compass with a private north. Language flowed, but it borrowed. A turn of phrase from a college roommate turned up like a coin in a couch. He wasn't confabulating confabulation, the polite lie the brain tells to cover a hole. He was placing a new picture onto an old frame, then insisting the frame was correct because it fit his hands. We asked infectious disease to rule out sleepy infections that hide behind normal lab coats. They found nothing except the fever's afternoon habit, 99 point to climbing to 100.3 and back down like a tide. We started a low dose of amantadine, not as a cure, but as a nudge. It made him brighter and no more right. We tried to recreate 317, lights low, the unit quiet, my voice tuned to the same cadence, as if we could coax a ghost by repeating a spell. He slept, that evening, in the kind light that makes the ward look almost kind. He watched the door and asked me, not anxious, just earnestly tired, Am I supposed to be him? Emily sat on the plastic chair with her hands clasped wide and said nothing because any answer would break something. Grief is a color I can see now even in a bright room. I spoke with ethics, which is to say I spoke with 3 kind people who keep track of lines and make sure we don't step over them without noticing. We agreed he had capacity for some decisions and not others, and that this is true for more people than medicine admits. We spoke with social work about how to discharge someone awake wrong into a world that only recognizes awake right. We debated whether telling him his dog had died in 2019 was kindness or cruelty when his world insisted the dog still slept under the piano. Mercy, we decided, is letting a man keep the furniture of his life in the rooms where it still fits. The afternoon of day 3, when the sun on the parking lot made the asphalt look like wet slate, he asked me, "What year did they move the coffee machine?" I said 2013 because I have that kind of memory, and he nodded like a man whose internal floor plan had finally aligned. "That's when it started," he said, and I didn't ask what it was. Night 3, I walked the unit at 3:10 like a man trying not to be someone else. The medroom keypad sat dark and normal, waiting for practical human fingers. At 3:17 nothing happened. Of course nothing happened. The world is not a circus, and I am not its audience, and yet. Day 4, he laughed at a joke Jordan made about cafeteria meatloaf with the easy familiarity of someone who'd eaten one to many brown plastic trays. He misnamed a resident with a name we retired from the unit in 2012 when a woman with the same name left for California. He asked if the old wall clock ever worked right after the battery bracket bent, a small complaint that lived for 2 months in 2014 and no longer lived anywhere but in me. Watching him felt like standing in a house built lovingly to the memory of another house that burned down. Every picture hung in exactly the wrong place. We consulted more because consultation is how you honor the weight of not knowing. Psychiatry came and ruled out florid psychosis because he wasn't psychotic. He was coherent and precise and wrong in only one axis. Sleep medicine suggested circadian chaos and started melatonin, and the nights got a little smoother and the days a little less jangly, but the map stayed old. We sent a perineoplastic panel because I have seen immune systems behave like poets with poor boundaries, but the results would return weeks later with their shrug of negatives. We checked thyroid antibodies, B12, folate, HIV, syphilis, Lyme, the small horses we must check before we go hunting zebras. The herd trotted past, healthy, unhelpful. On day 5, he began to recede the way tide remembers gravity. Not a plunge, not a loss, just a careful stepping back. He tracked less, he spoke less. When he did, he called Emily by the ordinary name she'd worn for 15 years instead of Emmylou. Kindness returns in small mercies. He slept, the eek softened from meadow to marsh. When he woke he looked like a man who had been on the porch while a storm passed and didn't he know if he'd imagined the rain. Before discharge back to the LTAC, we held a meeting in a small conference room that smelled faintly of dry erase and coffee grounds. The case manager spread forms the way dealers spread cards. The social worker talked about home health and follow-up and what Medicare says care should look like when a person is technically the same but subjectively moved a few inches to the left. Emily listened with the stillness of someone squeezing a hand under the table where no one could see. I wrote a discharge summary that read like a man leaving room for ghosts, fluctuating level of consciousness with a typical temporal orientation. Etiology unclear. Consider prolonged post-traumatic confusional state. Cannot entirely exclude non-convulsive epileptiform activity despite normal EEG. Recommend outpatient neuropsychological evaluation and structured environmental cues. That is how you say in Latin that the ocean did something to you and you don't know what the tide wants. After we loaded him into the transport cot, Emily asked me in the doorway, "Will he come back like that again?" The way he was, I wanted to promise a ritual. I wanted to tell her there's a time and a code and a way to stand in the right spot and the door opens, and it's always 3:17 if you love someone enough. I said the brain is not a lighthouse, It doesn't turn on the same way twice. She nodded because she is kinder to me than I have been to anyone after midnight. 3 weeks later, I put my letter on my chief's desk and spoke the lines we use when we want to leave without breaking anything. I need a different pace, I said. I want to focus on ambulatory care. I'm tired. The truth I didn't say is that I had declared people gone with a clarity that let other people live. And after Daniel I couldn't make those sentences form without hearing a retired code chirp and assent. It shouldn't to be able to give. I had started asking nurses to read the patient at 3:17 as if ritual could replace rigor, as if pattern could forestall grief. That is not a way to be a doctor. That is a way to want the world to wink at you. What do I believe now? I believe consciousness is not a light switch, it's a coastline. The maps are tidy, the reality ragged, coves hiding under fog where boats can shelter or sink, sandbars where you thought there was water and deep water where you thought there was none. EEGs and MRIs are satellites, useful and blind, and we have been tricked by their altitude into thinking every inlet is a mistake. I believe memory, in a library where you shelve a book. It's a sweater, and sometimes one pulled thread changes how the whole garment sits on your shoulders. We measured what we could, we missed what mattered because it slips in from the side door when you are busy updating firmware. No jump scares here, and that's what lingers when the lights stay on. I think about the ethics team's careful words and the social worker's folder, and how mercy sometimes means letting a man be misstated if that's the only way he can stay whole. I think about Alma's phrase and Jordan's maiden name and the way a hospital's old name can sit under the new paint like a watermark. I think about Emily's yes and no and would you please and the quiet you learn to carry when you live between what happened and what should have. I tell you one more thing and then I let you go. I came in on a Monday to nights after his discharge to box up my neurologist life, my dog-eared textbooks, and the coffee mug my daughter painted lopsided red when she was 6. The unit was at that calm pitch it hits when daylight and fluorescent light agree to call a truce. The med room keypad waited in its brushed metal rectangle, patient as a guard. The green light glowed steady. The screen that should stay blank until you touch it blinked the old master code for square presses any nurse who has been here more than a decade could do in muscle memory waiting, as if it expected my fingers to remember the rest. Would you have stayed in that room with me? If you're still here, you're braver than I was. And if this rattled you, the next case made this one feel harmless.